Hey there, Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement and bringing you another edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday training, where I take a concept, a strategy, the exercise science of it all, the behavior science of it all, and bring it to you in a meaningful way so that you can deliver outstanding fitness and adapted PE programs to your autism and neurodivergent life skill athletes, or if they're sport-specific or activity-specific athletes, that as well, because general strength and fitness is going to bring benefits to all areas of life. Before I get started, please definitely subscribe, and share these videos with people for whom it might make a difference, whether they've been doing fitness programs forever or wanting to figure out where to get started. So in this edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday training, I am going to be talking about how often to change up the variables, specifically the exercises or the programming or the activities. And this is a common misconception. I think it's oftentimes misapplied in both fitness programming and in adapted PE programming, because we focus on one particular variable or one particular aspect that is really not the main concern when it comes to skill acquisition. So let's start there. Let's start with skill acquisition. If we are looking at the achievement or goal setting component of fitness or adapted PE programs, because of course, if we're calling it physical education, even adapted physical education, what is the educational component? Meaning, what are our students or athletes learning? How is it being conveyed? How is the skill being developed? And how is it then generalizing? So if we're starting with goals, we have to have a plan in order to meet those goals. And even though time is a factor, it should not be the predominant or the main factor in deciding when to change up an activity or a particular exercise. I'll give you an example. So let's say we're talking about the squat, and we're working with an athlete, regardless of whether they are neurotypical or neurodivergent. And that athlete, we assess them, and they can do a bodyweight squat for, let's say, 8 or 9 reps. The next week, it would make 0 sense to load them up with 175 pounds and say, now you're going to squat 175 pounds, right? Because they don't yet have the skill, the strength, and the stability in order to perform that movement at that particular level of challenge. So that's one way that we look at time-based, not necessarily coinciding with skill-based, because it's going to take much more time and much more practice in order to develop that strength skill. So on another continuum, when we're looking at programs, there is the common idea, and it's not necessarily wrong, that we want to change up exercise programming every 4 to 6 weeks. Because the idea is, and again, the premise isn't necessarily incorrect, that the body is going to habituate to that particular exercise after those 4 or 6 weeks. But here's the problem with that. If an athlete is performing a modified variation of an exercise, let's say bringing it back to that squat, the athlete is squatting to a bench or to a low box because they haven't yet met standard performance of that exercise. They can't do the exercise to full healthy range of motion independently without that modification. Fine, but then we have to consider how long and how much practice is it going to take for that athlete to meet that particular goal? And it's probably going to be longer than 4 to 6 weeks. So it doesn't make any sense from a skill acquisition standpoint to change up that exercise just because 5 or 6 or 8 weeks have elapsed. We want to go with the athlete's current level of ability and not give them a progression too soon, but just giving them a more challenging variation of the exercise is not in and of itself going to enable them to develop the skill. Giving them the challenge at their current level of ability is going to continue to develop the motor planning and the strength and the stability and the stamina or endurance to perform the exercise correctly. So it's not as though we want to change up the exercise only because a certain amount of time has elapsed. So we're looking at the calendar and saying, wow, it's been 8 weeks. we should change this exercise because the body has not yet gained the absolute most that it can possibly gain out of that exercise. So it's not that the exercise is stale. It's not that the exercise is no longer performing a benefit. In fact, if that athlete is still performing that exercise at a modified level, we want to keep going and keep going and keep going because we haven't even reached the point yet where that exercise is providing the full benefit for that particular athlete. Now, let's take it from a programming standpoint, and this is really common to change out the entire program every 4 to 6 weeks. And I'm going to give you an example and switch it up a little bit, not just discussing the physical component, but the adaptive component also. In Autism Fitness, of course, we use the PAC profile, that's physical, adaptive, and cognitive, and we utilize that to assess and address each skill that is most important to physical activity and exercise. So physical, the exercises themselves, adaptive, motivation and reinforcement, and then cognitive, communication and coaching, kinesthetic awareness. So when we consider adaptive functioning, I had an athlete recently whose parent reached out to me and said, I think they might be getting bored with their program. And I thought, you know what, maybe it is time to change some of the exercises in the program. So the athlete comes in the next week and I have on his board a few different new exercise variations. And I said, hey, instead of the squatting to the box today, because I think it was time to test a free squat, I'm going to have you, hold the light band and squat without the box. And then with this standing row, we're going to switch it to a seated pull down. So I had 2 or 3 variations and I could see in his eyes that this was an entire sea change of the program. So I needed to back up a little bit and stay within his comfort zone and say, all right, well, how about incorporating one new exercise? And he was cool with that. And immediately, what was very telling about it, he said, but first we'll start out the way we usually do. So the whole idea of boredom is often misapplied also. And I think this is sometimes something that is projected from the coach or projected from the parent onto the athlete, like, oh, it's been 8 weeks, or oh, it's been 12 weeks, or oh, it's been 23 weeks. They must be getting bored. But the fact is that for many of our autism and neurodivergent athletes, that structure and regulated and predictable program is what enables them to thrive. So switching it up all of a sudden is probably not the best idea. It worked for this athlete in my case, that we just changed 2 of the exercises, one pushing exercise, one pulling exercise, and a different variation of the squat, not just to change it up, but because he was ready for it and he's been progressing for well over 2 years in some of these exercises. Changing up an exercise doesn't completely change the stimulus either. It's not as though a variation of an exercise is going to create a muscular contraction that is so different from the original variation of the exercise that it is an absolute necessity. Sometimes variety makes sense, and this is usually the case once an athlete has independently mastered that particular exercise at a particular level. Now, let's talk about this with respect to group programs, particularly in the adapted PE realm. One of the things that I encounter, and I get a lot of feedback on from parents, is that their school is doing a competitive sports-based curriculum for who knows what reason, because they're trying to emulate what has gone on in general PE, or it's just easier, or it looks good on paper, right? Or on a screen for that matter, to update it to 2025. I know paper still exists, but most people read things on screens. Anyway, a sports-based program, like, what is the intended outcome of it? Number one, is it to, if it is in fact to develop those sports-based skills and the unit is only 4 to 6 weeks long, what skills are actually being developed? Is there data being collected on how much that particular student or individual has increased their capabilities with basketball or soccer or baseball? So we have a couple questions here about whether or not the modality actually is conducive to any type of progress. for that athlete, whether those skills are actually going to be generalized to someday or some situation in which they're going to play that sport, which quite frankly, we all know is unlikely, because it's unlikely for most individuals. Most individuals who have some type of PE program that's sports-based, they usually don't go out and then play that sport. They're probably, if they are, they're already playing that sport because they already enjoy it. They're already playing extracurricular. So, the whole notion of playing that sport and then playing it for like 4 to 6 or 8 weeks and then switching it up to something else, the educational component only occurs if there's actually baseline measurement of their participation and of their skills and what is happening over time. So to say that we're going to do a unit of this and then a unit of that and then a unit of this, okay, fine, but why are we changing it up when we're changing it up? What is the reasoning behind implementing or utilizing that particular activity? And what is the goal? Is the goal to develop the skills in that particular setting and nothing else? Is the idea to generalize, to develop those skills so they generalize to the outside world? Like what is the point here? So again, the time-based constraint, or the idea of we're going to change it up, is based on a couple of notions. Sometimes they are true and oftentimes a little less so, because the idea of 6 to 8 weeks of this and then we're going to switch it up. Are we switching it up simply because of this arbitrary 6 to 8 week period that, again, does have some evidence with respect to strength training or general fitness, but we have to be careful about changing everything at once, both from a physical and from an adaptive perspective for the athlete, because they may not be motivated to engage in a program that's completely changed from one week to another. And then we have to look at the skill acquisition component. If we have an athlete who is not yet ready for a variation of an exercise or a progression of an exercise, then it does not make sense to integrate or introduce that variation or that progression of an exercise. And especially in group settings where athletes are going to have most likely less one-to-one attention, and they're also going to have less engagement in the activity just by way of there being more participants. We have to be really careful about changing up the structure regularly, because the athletes who are just starting to acquire the skill or just starting to engage in the activity are going to have a really difficult time acquiring those skills if they don't have enough time and practice to acquire those skills. So coming back to best practices in terms of implementing programs, number one, of course, in our autism fitness curriculum, we base everything off of strength and resistance training, because those exercises not only have the highest generalization to activities of daily living, safety, stability, and real independence in real life situations, but they are scalable. So in a one-to-one situation or in a group situation, we are able to modify or progress the exercise based on the needs of that particular individual. So coming back to this time-based thing, if we have an athlete who needs 8 weeks to go from a modified variation of that exercise to the standard where they're independent, they can do it for 3 sets of 8 or 10 reps, great. They are allotted that amount of time. And then if we have an athlete who is progressed from the very start, great, they can continue to progress. And rather than look at it from everybody is going to move at the same rate, at the same level through all 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, which is never the case, we can make sure that it's more individualized, again, even in group settings for each individual. That is very difficult to do with sports programs and even games. It's often difficult to track the non-participatory athletes and how much they're starting to engage. So rather than take a time-based approach to programming, we want to take a programming-based approach or a skill acquisition-based approach to programming. And of course, time is always going to be a factor throughout the year, especially in school or clinical settings. And we do want to set certain goals, but those goals should not be arbitrarily assigned to just a certain amount of time, because some of our athletes are going to take 6 months to be able to squat independently or to move up from a modified version. And some of our athletes are going to take 60 minutes to get to that point. So the whole idea of changing things up regularly and causing muscle confusion or not getting bored are often misapplied, particularly for our ASD and neurodivergent population. So what we want to do is take a skills-based approach and ensure that the athlete is getting the particular programming and coaching and continued support that they need in order to actually develop the skills, so that that skill does something in their life. I hope that this has been demystifying for you. I'd love to know what you think. You can leave your comments in the comment section below. I answer everything. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, or if you want me to cover another topic in a future edition of Tuesday Training, leave that in the comments below also. And of course, if you are ready to join the Movement for Movement and become an Autism Fitness Certified Pro, reach out to me, or you can go directly to autismfitness.com. You can register and begin your coursework today, and then meet me or one of our master pros for your full day virtual practical, so that you get the hands-on, brains-on, feet-on training that you and your autism and neurodivergent athletes deserve. I'm Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen. Thank you for watching this edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday Training.